Tonight we begin with a development that Social Security officials had feared, dismissed, and quietly prepared for all at once. A shift that unfolded not over years of gradual policy reform, but in a single month. A single month that will change the monthly income of tens of millions of Americans. A single month that will force retirees, disabled workers, and survivors to rethink their budgets overnight. A single month that exposed just how fragile the financial safety net millions of Americans depend on truly is. What the Social Security Administration did this March crossed a line that seniors and advocates had hoped would hold. And when that line broke, Congress did not hesitate. They responded with alarm, urgency, and a flurry of emergency hearings that Washington hasn't seen in years. For months now, there had been signals, not official press releases, not formal policy announcements, just signals, that the Social Security Administration was preparing something unprecedented. The SSA has been operating under pressure, yes, but they have been aggressive in their silence about what was coming. Their moves had followed a certain rhythm, a cadence, almost a pattern. But what set off alarm bells in Washington this March was that the pattern went silent. Policy analysts who monitor federal benefit systems know the indicators. The quiet reshuffling of internal SSA budget allocations, the delay in updating the online benefits portal with 2025 projections, the unusually vague language in recent congressional testimony from SSA leadership, the sudden freeze on responses to Freedom of Information Act requests, all of that went quiet. And whenever the SSA goes quiet, it means something is about to get very loud for the people depending on those checks. Early this March, congressional budget analysts detected what they described as a structural recalibration of Social Security disbursement schedules, including a payment adjustment mechanism that had not been publicly activated in over a decade. These are the kinds of administrative tools that the SSA only deploys when they are signaling something very specific: a cost of living adjustment correction, a means testing pilot program, or a benefits recalculation tied to new earnings thresholds. Observers didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that the SSA was changing its disbursement posture. And when a federal benefits agency shifts its operational posture without public explanation, even by a small administrative margin, Congress pays attention. The warning issued by the Senate Finance Committee this month was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. Briefing after briefing described the SSA's March shift as overdue, sweeping, and perhaps most importantly, quietly irreversible without new legislation. But bureaucratic entrenchment only works if the public doesn't notice. The advocacy community noticed. In fact, the response from retiree groups, disability rights organizations, and senior advocacy networks was among the most coordinated we've seen in a generation. Here's what we know. Within days of the SSA's announcement, over 40 senior advocacy organizations filed formal objections. These weren't the usual form letters. These were detailed legal briefs, documents crafted by constitutional and administrative law experts that the SSA only sees when affected communities are preparing to escalate. This month, sources confirmed that the SSA launched a benefits recalculation process affecting recipients across multiple categories, including survivors who had recently been reclassified under a revised household income formula that analysts believe was designed to reduce long-term program liability. The SSA acted before recipients could prepare financially. They recalculated benefits for retirees receiving spousal supplements. They adjusted payment timelines for disability recipients under the age of 62. They flagged accounts for review that were likely drawing benefits tied to deceased spouses' pre-2000 earnings records. In other words, the SSA targeted the most financially vulnerable portions of the recipient base, the foundation that would have kept those households financially stable. This is what made advocates' warnings so urgent. The SSA's move wasn't just administrative, it was consequential. It represented the kind of change that could reduce monthly income for millions of households if left unchallenged. And advocacy groups, understanding that fully, responded with force, not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. They didn't file generic complaints. They didn't hold symbolic rallies. They targeted the legislative pressure points. They targeted the committee chairs with oversight authority. And here's where the story becomes even more alarming. Policy analysts now believe that the SSA's March move was designed to test the political will of Congress after years of gridlock on Social Security reform. The SSA wanted to see whether Congress would look the other way. But instead, the opposite happened. Congressional Democrats and Republicans didn't stay silent. They introduced emergency oversight legislation that was so bipartisan, so publicly visible, that even the White House took notice. You don't get the White House's attention on domestic entitlement policy easily, but this month, Congress did. Budget analysts speaking with major outlets under anonymity described the SSA's recalibration as a stress test, a way to identify which benefit structures the public would tolerate losing quietly. But advocates proved this month that the Social Security recipient community remains both informed and organized. Their responses were not only swift, they were documented so precisely that 3 congressional subcommittees launched independent reviews within 72 hours. That speed matters because it shows that the oversight infrastructure still works when activated. It shows that advocates and recipients are not passive observers. They are active participants in protecting their own benefits. As reports continued coming in throughout the month, we learned more about the scale of the SSA's recalculation. Retirees over the age of 70 were notified of potential payment reductions averaging between $40 and $90 per month. Disability recipients were flagged for mandatory earnings reviews that hadn't been required since 2009. Surviving spouses operating on single-income household budgets reportedly received letters questioning the validity of benefit claims tied to pre-retirement earning histories. This wasn't just a paperwork update. This wasn't just a routine administrative correction. This was a fundamental restructuring of how the SSA calculates ongoing eligibility. This was a precedent-setting action. And precedent-setting action is the one thing the SSA has struggled to push through without public resistance since the 1983 Reagan-era reforms. For every benefit category they have targeted, advocacy groups have countered with something that complicates the political math significantly. Remember, the SSA thought Americans had stopped paying attention to Social Security mechanics. They thought the complexity of the benefits formula would obscure the impact of gradual reductions. They thought Congress was too divided to respond with any urgency. But this March, the exact opposite is happening. Millions of recipients are reading their benefit letters with unprecedented scrutiny. Advocacy organizations are translating technical policy language into plain terms and distributing it widely. And Congress is discovering once again that Social Security is the third rail of American politics, for very good reason. What makes this moment so significant and so consequential is that the SSA's March shift happened at a time when the federal budget is under extraordinary pressure. Fiscal hawks want long-term solvency reforms, even if painful in the short term. Progressive Democrats want expanded benefits and higher wage caps on Social Security contributions. Moderate Republicans want means testing applied to higher income recipients. Senior voter blocs want ironclad guarantees that no currently receiving recipient will see a reduction. The SSA is balancing these demands while managing a trust fund that actuarial models project will face shortfalls by the early 2030s. And when federal agencies in that position make sudden moves, they're not doing it from a position of strength. They're doing it from pressure. They're doing it from institutional vulnerability. Congress's formal inquiry, now distributed across 6 committee jurisdictions, was designed to signal that the legislative branch is not willing to allow benefit reductions to move forward without full public transparency. Officials said plainly that the SSA's recalculation was inconsistent with the legislative intent of the Social Security Act. That is careful legal language for, you don't have the authority to do this unilaterally, and we intend to prove it. You don't usually hear that tone from Congress unless something with real electoral consequences is at stake. Meanwhile, the chair of the Senate Special Committee on Aging addressed a packed chamber in a direct, forceful speech this week. She said, No recipient who earned these benefits through a lifetime of work should open their mailbox to find them reduced without warning. She said, "This administration must answer for every dollar of benefit that has been quietly adjusted without congressional authorization." And she said, "We will not allow the complexity of this system to be used as a shield against accountability." These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from an institution that understands just how high the electoral stakes have become. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. The SSA's March recalculation wasn't isolated. Along with the core benefits adjustment, the Department of Treasury also updated its offset protocols, potentially allowing more aggressive recovery of overpayments. The Office of Management and Budget signaled support for accelerated means testing pilots in at least 3 states. CMS increased coordination with Social Security on dual eligibility reviews targeting Medicare and Medicaid recipients simultaneously. All of this happened within the same 30-day window. When federal agencies move multiple policy levers at once, it means something larger is underway. Analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that the SSA is preparing a phased reduction strategy designed to normalize lower benefit levels before the 2026 midterm elections. Another is that the SSA is attempting to preempt legislative reform by creating administrative facts on the ground. A third possibility, the one worrying advocates the most, is that the SSA is attempting to shift the political burden of solvency reform onto Congress by forcing a visible crisis. But this month, advocacy groups took that card off the table. They didn't wait for a court ruling. They didn't wait for a new election cycle. They didn't wait for the media to catch up. They mobilized immediately, loudly, and with documented evidence. What we're watching now is a test of institutional accountability. The SSA wants to see whether complex administrative changes can proceed without triggering organized public resistance. Advocates and recipients want to show that Social Security's beneficiary community is too large, too organized, and too politically consequential to be quietly restructured. Congress wants to prevent a benefits crisis from becoming an electoral catastrophe, and the White House wants to prevent the entire issue from becoming the defining domestic story of 2026. Tonight, we've heard from policy monitors who are now tracking benefit adjustment notices being sent to households across 38 states. They say the volume of adjustment letters exceeds anything mailed since the 2000 recalculation cycle. They say the language in these letters is deliberately technical, making it difficult for recipients without professional guidance to assess their actual exposure. And they say the SSA's decision to implement these changes in March, a month before tax season ends, is likely part of a broader timing strategy intended to minimize immediate political response. But advocates are not staying quiet. In fact, recipient organizations are mobilizing in ways not seen since the early debates over Social Security privatization. Their response this month, coordinated, documented, and politically targeted, sent a message to the SSA that this community will not absorb changes silently. And it sent a message to Congress that their constituents are paying close attention to every vote cast on this issue. As this month goes on, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly the SSA hoped to achieve with this recalibration. But what we do know is that the congressional response was timely. It forced a public accounting of changes that were moving quietly through administrative channels. It gave recipients critical time to understand what adjustments may affect them. And it reminded every federal agency involved that Social Security is not an abstraction. It is the financial foundation of over 67 million Americans. What happens next will depend on what the SSA does in the next 60 days. If they reverse course, this moment will be remembered as a critical accountability checkpoint. If they press forward, advocates and Congress have already shown they are positioned, prepared, and politically motivated to escalate. And tonight, for the first time in years, the SSA appears to be recalculating, not just benefits, but its own political exposure. Washington is watching, too closely for comfort. And when the SSA is under this level of scrutiny, it means they are choosing their next move very carefully. Because this month, the Social Security Administration learned something the institution has learned before, but apparently needed to learn again. 67 million Americans vote. 67 million Americans talk to their families about what arrives in their mailboxes. And 67 million Americans remember, on Election Day, exactly who protected their benefits and who did not. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is clear. The March Social Security shift has awakened a constituency that was never truly asleep. The era of quiet administrative restructuring, without public accountability, is over. And every official who thought otherwise now has their answer. We will be here, watching every detail as the next phase unfolds.